My name is Emma Wright. I'm 28 years old, and 2 weeks ago, my father stood in the doorway of what used to be my childhood home and told me I had exactly 14 days to pack my things and leave because I was, in his words, completely useless and a burden on this family. The words hit me like a freight train, not because they were shocking. He'd been building up to this for years, but because in that moment, I realized something that would change everything. The person who was supposed to protect me had become my biggest obstacle, and staying in that house meant staying small forever. I didn't cry, I didn't beg, I didn't even argue. I just looked him in the eyes and made a decision right there that would flip the entire script of my life. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or been told you weren't good enough, hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to share will show you exactly how I turned their rejection into my greatest weapon. You're probably wondering how a father could look at his own daughter and call her useless, how a family could just discard someone like yesterday's trash. Well, let me take you back to where this all really started, because my story isn't just about being kicked out. It's about what happens when the people who were supposed to lift you up spend years tearing you down instead. My dad, Richard, had always been the type of man who measured worth in dollar signs and job titles. And my older brother, Michael, was his golden child who could do no wrong, while I was just the daughter who never amounted to anything. The house I grew up in wasn't a home. It was a scoreboard where I was always losing, and every dinner table conversation was a reminder that I didn't quite measure up to their impossible standards. But here's what they didn't know. While they were so busy telling me what I couldn't do, I was quietly learning exactly who I was without their approval, and that knowledge was about to become the foundation of something they never saw coming. I packed my bags in silence over those 2 weeks, and every item I folded and placed in those boxes wasn't just clothing or books. It was a piece of the old Emma, the one who believed she needed their validation to exist. The day I walked out of that house, I wasn't running away from them. I was running toward a version of myself that had been suffocating under their expectations for far too long. What happened next would prove that being called useless was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it forced me to stop proving my worth to people who would never see it and start building a life where my value was undeniable. The moment those words left my father's mouth, "You're useless," something inside me cracked, but not in the way you might think. It wasn't a breaking down. It was a breaking open, like a dam finally giving way after years of pressure building up behind it. I remember standing there in the living room, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, and feeling this strange mixture of devastation and clarity wash over me all at once. My hands were trembling, my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and yet there was this voice in the back of my mind whispering, "Finally, now you know exactly where you stand." If this story is resonating with you, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. You're going to want to see how I turned this moment of rejection into my ultimate comeback. The days that followed were some of the strangest of my life, because I was living in this weird limbo where I was still physically in the house but emotionally already gone. My mother, Patricia, walked around avoiding eye contact with me, and my brother Michael actually had the nerve to tell me, "Maybe if you'd gotten a real job instead of wasting time, Dad wouldn't be so disappointed in you." Every meal was silent and suffocating. Every hallway encounter felt like walking past strangers, and I started to understand that I had been invisible in this family long before my father made it official. I would lie in my childhood bed at night, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck to the ceiling when I was 10, and think about all the times I'd tried to make them proud, the grades, the extracurriculars, the sacrificing of my own dreams to fit into their vision of success. But here's what I realized during those 2 weeks that changed everything. Their rejection wasn't actually about me being useless. It was about them being unable to see value in anything that didn't fit their narrow definition of success. My father measured worth in corporate jobs and six-figure salaries, but I had spent the last few years working in social services, helping people who actually needed it, making a difference that couldn't be measured in dollar signs. I wasn't useless. I was just useful in ways they refused to recognize, and that distinction became my North Star as I prepared to leave. The pain of being discarded by your own family is something that cuts deeper than any breakup or lost friendship, because these are the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. And when that love comes with conditions you can't meet, it feels like drowning in a pool while everyone watches from the edge and tells you to just swim better. On day 3 of my 2-week countdown, I woke up and made a decision that I didn't tell a single person about. Not my friends, not my coworkers, not even myself out loud, because saying it would make it real and terrifying. I decided that I wasn't going to just leave. I was going to disappear so completely from their lives that they would feel the absence of what they threw away. This wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. I wasn't plotting to destroy them or make them suffer, but I was determined to remove myself so thoroughly that they would never have the satisfaction of watching me struggle or the opportunity to take credit if I succeeded. I sat at the edge of my bed that morning with my laptop open, and instead of scrolling through job listings in the same city or looking for cheap apartments nearby like they probably expected, I started researching something bigger. I had always wanted to move to Seattle. It was one of those dreams I'd tucked away in the maybe someday folder of my mind, because staying close to family seemed like the responsible thing to do. But now, with nothing tying me to this place except painful memories and people who didn't want me there, that dream suddenly felt less like a fantasy and more like a lifeline. I started looking at job opportunities, apartment listings, calculating costs, mapping out a timeline, and with each click and calculation, I felt this sense of power returning to my body that I hadn't felt in years. My father thought he was pushing me out of the nest, but what he actually did was cut the last thread that was keeping me tethered to a life that was never really mine to begin with. The beauty of making decisions in silence is that nobody can talk you out of them or plant seeds of doubt before your resolve has a chance to take root. I applied to 12 different positions in Seattle over the next 4 days: social work positions, nonprofit organizations, community outreach programs, all places where my experience and passion would actually be valued instead of dismissed. I didn't tell my family that I was looking outside the state. I let them believe I'd be moving to some cramped studio apartment across town, struggling to make ends meet and eventually coming back to apologize for being such a disappointment. But I wasn't planning a return. I was planning an escape, a complete reinvention, and every day that passed brought me closer to a moment when they would realize they didn't just lose a daughter. They lost someone who would have moved mountains for their approval if they'd ever thought to ask instead of demand. By day 7, something remarkable happened. I got a call back from a nonprofit organization in Seattle called New Horizons Community Services, and the woman on the phone, Linda Chen, spoke to me with more respect and genuine interest in 5 minutes than my father had shown me in 5 years. She asked about my experience working with at-risk youth, listened intently as I described the programs I'd helped develop, and then said something that made my eyes water right there in my childhood bedroom. "Emma, people like you who actually care about making a difference are rare, and we'd be lucky to have you on our team." I had to mute myself for a second because my throat was tight with emotion, and I realized this was what validation from someone who actually saw my worth felt like. It felt like breathing after being underwater for too long. Before I continue, make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button, because what happens next proves that sometimes the people who reject you are doing you the biggest favor of your life, and you'll want to see how this all unfolds. The interview was scheduled for 3 days later, which meant it would happen right at the end of my 2-week deadline, and I knew I had to handle this carefully because I couldn't let my family catch wind of what I was planning. I told them I was going to visit my friend Jessica for a couple of days to clear my head before the move, which wasn't technically a lie since Jessica did live 2 hours away and I did need to clear my head. My father barely looked up from his newspaper when I mentioned it, just grunted something about not coming back expecting sympathy, and my mother gave me this pitying look that made me want to scream because pity is just another form of looking down on someone. I packed a small bag with my best interview outfit hidden under casual clothes, and as I walked out the door that morning, I felt this electric current running through my veins, the current of possibility, of doors opening while others slammed shut. The bus ride to Seattle felt like traveling through a portal to a different dimension, watching the familiar landscape of my hometown fade away in the rearview mirror and new horizons literally appear on the horizon ahead. I stayed with Jessica that first night, and over wine and takeout Chinese food, I finally told someone the whole truth about the rejection, about the interview, about the plan to completely restart my life in a new city. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "Emma, I've watched you shrink yourself for years trying to fit into their box, and honestly, I've been waiting for you to break free." We stayed up until 3 in the morning talking about dreams and possibilities, and she made me promise that no matter what happened with the interview, I wouldn't go back to that house, that I'd stay with her until I figured out my next move. That promise became my safety net, the thing that made taking this leap feel less like jumping off a cliff and more like jumping toward something solid and real. Walking into the New Horizons office the next morning felt surreal, like I was stepping into a version of my life that had only existed in my daydreams until now. The space itself was nothing fancy, just a converted warehouse in the Capitol Hill neighborhood with colorful murals on the walls painted by the youth they served and that particular smell of coffee and hope that nonprofit offices seem to have. Linda greeted me at the door with a warm handshake and this genuine smile that immediately put me at ease. And as she walked me through the building, introducing me to staff members and showing me the programs they ran, I felt something I hadn't felt in my father's house in years. I felt like I belonged. She didn't ask me why I was looking to relocate or probe into my personal life. She focused entirely on my skills, my passion, and what I could bring to their mission of helping young people find their path when the world had written them off. The interview itself lasted almost 2 hours, but it didn't feel like an interrogation. It felt like a conversation between people who spoke the same language about purpose and impact. Linda asked me to describe a time when I'd helped someone who seemed unreachable, and I told her about Marcus, a 17-year-old kid in my current program who'd been kicked out of 3 schools and had everyone convinced he was a lost cause. I explained how I'd spent 6 months just showing up consistently, not trying to fix him or change him, just being present and letting him know that someone believed he had value even when he didn't believe it himself. "And did it work?" Linda asked, leaning forward in her chair with this intense interest in her eyes. I smiled and told her that Marcus had just gotten accepted to community college and was volunteering at an animal shelter on weekends, that he'd sent me a text last week that said, "Thanks for not giving up on me when everyone else did, even when I was trying to make you give up." Linda was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then she said something that I'll remember for the rest of my life. "Emma, what you just described is exactly what we do here. We see potential where others see problems. We invest time where others see waste, and we believe that every person deserves someone in their corner fighting for them." She offered me the position right there on the spot, a salary that was actually higher than what I'd been making, and a start date in 2 weeks that would give me just enough time to make the move. I walked out of that office and into the Seattle rain. Yes, it was literally raining, because of course it was. And I stood there on the sidewalk, letting the water hit my face, mixing with the tears that were streaming down my cheeks, and I felt this overwhelming sense of rightness. This was what it felt like to be wanted, to be valued, to be seen for who you actually were instead of who people expected you to be. And in that moment, I knew that my father calling me useless was the catalyst that pushed me toward becoming the most useful version of myself I'd ever been. The next 72 hours were a blur of logistics, planning, and keeping secrets that felt like they were burning a hole in my chest every time I was around my family. I flew back home, well, to the place that used to be home, and walked through that front door knowing it was one of the last times I'd ever do it. And the strange thing was how little I felt about that fact. My father was in his study as usual, my mother was watching television in the living room, and Michael was over for dinner because of course he was. The prodigal son always had a seat at the table. Nobody asked about my trip, nobody seemed curious about where I'd been or what I'd been doing, and their complete lack of interest in my life became the final confirmation I needed that leaving wasn't just the right choice, it was the only choice. I spent the next 3 days packing with surgical precision, separating my life into 3 categories: things I absolutely needed, things I could sell or donate, and things that belonged to a version of Emma who no longer existed. Every item I touched carried memories, some good, most complicated, and I found myself having these quiet conversations with my younger self as I packed, apologizing to her for taking so long to realize she deserved better than this. I sold my car to a college student for cash, because I'd researched Seattle's public transportation and wouldn't need it there. And that transaction alone gave me enough money for first month's rent and security deposit on a small studio apartment I'd found online in the Fremont neighborhood. I opened a new bank account at a different institution than the one my parents had helped me set up when I was 16, transferred everything over, and felt this sense of financial independence that was both terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. The hardest part wasn't the physical packing or the financial maneuvering. It was maintaining the facade that I was just moving across town to some sad little apartment where they could continue to look down on me from their comfortable perch of judgment. My father asked me once on day 12 if I'd found a place yet, and I told him yes, somewhere affordable, nothing special, and he just nodded with this satisfied look on his face like he'd predicted this exact outcome. He had no idea that somewhere affordable was actually a cozy studio with exposed brick walls and huge windows overlooking the ship canal, in a city where I'd be starting a job that paid more than what he probably assumed I was capable of earning. The lie felt powerful because it wasn't really about deceiving them. It was about protecting my truth from people who had never earned the right to know it. And every time I deflected their half-interested questions with vague answers, I felt myself getting stronger. Day 14 arrived with the kind of crisp morning clarity that feels like the universe is paying attention to important moments. I woke up at 5 a.m. even though I didn't need to, my body buzzing with this mixture of anxiety and anticipation that made sleep impossible. The moving truck I'd secretly hired was scheduled to arrive at 9, during the window when my father would be at work and my mother would be at her book club, and I'd orchestrated this timing with the precision of a heist movie because I knew if they were there to witness my actual departure, it would turn into a scene I didn't have the energy for. I walked through each room one final time, not out of nostalgia, but out of necessity, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything. Closing drawers and doors both literally and metaphorically, saying goodbye to the ghost of who I used to be in these spaces. If you're watching this and you've ever had to walk away from family who couldn't see your worth, hit that subscribe button and leave a like, because what I'm about to share next shows that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is leave quietly instead of burning bridges loudly. The movers arrived exactly on time. 2 efficient guys named Tom and Carlos who loaded my entire life into their truck in under 2 hours, and I paid them in cash with a generous tip because they were helping me move toward freedom, and that was worth every penny. I left my key on the kitchen counter with a note that said simply, "Thank you for the lessons. I'll be fine. Emma." I didn't leave a forwarding address. I didn't leave a phone number. I just left. And the weight that lifted off my shoulders as I closed that door for the last time felt like shedding a 100-pound backpack I'd been carrying up a mountain my entire life. I drove my rental car behind the moving truck with all my windows down, despite the cool air, needing to feel the wind in my hair and the physical sensation of movement and change. My phone buzzed around noon. My mother had come home early and found the note, and the text messages started rolling in. Confusion, anger, accusations of being dramatic and ungrateful, threats about how I'd come crawling back when reality hit me. I read each one while stopped at a red light somewhere in Oregon, and then I did something that felt both terrifying and liberating. I blocked all their numbers, not forever necessarily, but for now, because I needed space to build this new life without their voices in my head telling me all the ways I was doing it wrong. The silence that followed was deafening at first, but then it became peaceful, like finally being able to hear my own thoughts without someone else's commentary drowning them out. The first week in Seattle was harder than I'd anticipated, not because I regretted my decision, but because starting over is legitimately one of the most exhausting things a human can do. My studio apartment was empty except for the basics: a mattress on the floor, some boxes I hadn't unpacked yet, and a folding chair I'd bought at Target that became my dining room table, desk, and meditation spot, all rolled into one. I'd wake up in the morning disoriented, forgetting for a split second where I was, and then reality would crash over me like a wave. I was in Seattle, I was alone, I had no safety net, and everything from this point forward was entirely up to me. Some mornings that realization felt empowering, like I was the captain of my own ship finally, and other mornings it felt terrifying, like I'd jumped out of a plane and was still waiting to see if my parachute would open. My first day at New Horizons was a whirlwind of paperwork, orientations, meeting dozens of people whose names I immediately forgot, and trying to navigate an entirely new organizational culture. Linda paired me with a mentor named Marcus. Yes, coincidentally the same name as the kid I'd helped back home, which felt like some kind of cosmic sign, who was a veteran youth counselor with 15 years of experience, and this calm, grounded energy that immediately made me feel less like I was drowning. He took me to lunch at this hole-in-the-wall Vietnamese restaurant and told me something I desperately needed to hear. The first month is always the hardest, because you're learning not just a new job, but a new version of yourself, and that's double the work. So be patient with the process and with yourself. I nearly cried into my foe because nobody in my family had ever told me it was okay to struggle while learning, that difficulty didn't equal failure. But the adjustment wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal in ways I hadn't prepared for. I didn't know anyone in Seattle except Jessica, who lived 2 hours away. I didn't know which grocery stores were good or which neighborhoods to avoid at night, and I definitely didn't know how to combat the loneliness that would hit me at random moments like a sucker punch to the gut. I'd be walking home from work watching all these people who seemed to belong here, who had friends to meet and places to be, and I'd feel this acute awareness of my aloneness that was different from the loneliness I'd felt at my father's house. That loneliness had been surrounded by people. This loneliness was just me and my thoughts and the city sounds filtering through my window at night, and I had to learn to sit with it instead of running from it because running was what had kept me stuck for so long. 3 weeks into my new life, something shifted. Not dramatically, not overnight, but gradually, like the sun rising so slowly you don't notice until suddenly it's light outside. I got my first paycheck from New Horizons, and seeing that direct deposit hit my account felt like validation in numerical form that I was actually doing this, actually surviving, actually building something real. I went to IKEA that weekend and bought real furniture, a bed frame, a small couch, a bookshelf, kitchen supplies, and the act of assembling each piece felt metaphorical in the best way, like I was constructing not just furniture, but the infrastructure of a life that was entirely mine. I sent a picture of my newly furnished apartment to Jessica with the caption, "Look what useless built," and she responded with about 20 fire emojis and a voice message saying she was proud of me, which made me realize how starved I'd been for that kind of genuine support. Work started to feel less overwhelming and more purposeful as I settled into my role and met the young people I'd be working with directly. There was this 16-year-old girl named Jasmine who reminded me so much of myself at that age. Smart, capable, but completely convinced she wasn't good enough because the adults in her life had spent years telling her so through their actions, if not their words. During our first one-on-one session, she sat across from me with her arms crossed defensively and said, "Why should I trust you? You're just going to leave like everyone else." I looked at her and saw my younger self so clearly that I had to take a breath before responding, and I told her something true. "You're right, that I might not be here forever. But while I am here, I'm going to show up for you consistently, and I'm going to believe in you even when you don't believe in yourself, and that's a promise." The small victories started accumulating like coins in a jar, making a connection with a difficult kid, finding my favorite coffee shop where the barista started remembering my order, discovering a running trail along the waterfront that became my therapy session, joining a book club at the local library where I met people who might actually become friends. Each of these moments was tiny and insignificant on its own, but together they were building a foundation of belonging that felt earned rather than inherited. I wasn't Emma the disappointing daughter anymore. I was Emma the youth counselor, Emma the new neighbor who always said hello, Emma who was figuring out her life, one small decision at a time, and that identity felt more authentic than anything I'd ever been in my father's house where I was just Emma the failure, Emma the burden, Emma who never quite measured up to the family's expectations. 2 months into my Seattle life, I got a text from an unknown number that turned out to be my mother. She'd gotten a new phone, or was texting from someone else's because I'd blocked her original number. The message was short and devastating in its casualness. "Emma, your father's birthday is next week, and we're having dinner at Rosewood on Saturday at 7. Please come. It would mean a lot to him." I stared at that text for a solid 5 minutes, my coffee getting cold in my hand, feeling this surreal disconnect between the life she thought I was living and the reality of where I actually was. She genuinely believed I was still in town, probably struggling in some depressing apartment, available to show up for family obligations whenever they summoned me, and the assumption behind that belief was almost more insulting than the original rejection had been. Before I tell you what I did next, make sure you're subscribed and drop a like if you think what I'm about to do is justified, because this is where everything they thought they knew about me completely shattered. I didn't respond to the text immediately. I let it sit there for 2 days, marinating in the silence, because I wanted to craft a response that was honest without being cruel, clear without being apologetic. Finally, I wrote back, I won't be able to make it. I'm living in Seattle now, started a new job that I love, and I'm building a life that doesn't include people who called me useless and threw me away. I hope you all have a nice dinner. Take care. I hit send and then immediately blocked that number too, not out of anger but out of self-preservation, because I knew what would come next, and I didn't have the emotional bandwidth for their shock, their outrage, or their attempts to make me feel guilty for choosing myself. According to Jessica, who heard it through the grapevine from a mutual friend who was still connected to my family's social circle, the dinner was apparently quite dramatic. My father spent the entire evening calling me selfish and ungrateful to anyone who would listen. My mother cried and told people she had no idea I'd left the state, and Michael, ever the golden child, declared that I was being childish and attention-seeking, that I'd come crawling back once I realized how hard the real world was. But here's what they didn't know, and what made their whole narrative fall apart. I wasn't struggling. I wasn't suffering. I wasn't proving them right by failing. I was thriving in ways they couldn't even imagine because they'd never actually paid attention to who I really was. The image they had of me was so outdated and so based on their own projections that the real me, the capable and independent me, was completely invisible to them even when the evidence was staring them in the face. Around month 4, something profound happened that I didn't see coming. I stopped thinking about them. Not in an angry way or a forced way, but genuinely. My days were so full of meaningful work and new experiences and building authentic connections that my family just naturally faded into the background noise of my past instead of the screaming headlines of my present. I'd catch myself going entire weeks without wondering what they thought or whether they'd noticed my absence. And that realization was more liberating than any revenge scenario I could have dreamed up. The opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And I was finally reaching that blessed state of indifference where they simply didn't occupy the mental real estate they used to. Work became more than just a job. It became my purpose and my proof that I'd been right all along about who I was and what I was capable of. I developed a new program at New Horizons, focused on helping teenagers from difficult home situations develop practical life skills and emotional resilience. Basically everything I'd had to teach myself the hard way over the past few months. Linda was so impressed with the proposal that she not only approved it, but asked me to present it to the board of directors. And standing in front of those 12 people, explaining my vision and watching them nod and ask engaged questions felt like the ultimate validation. The program got full funding, I got a raise and a promotion to senior youth advocate, and suddenly the girl who was useless 6 months ago was being asked to speak at conferences and write articles about innovative approaches to youth services. But the real strength I discovered wasn't in the professional accomplishments. It was in the quiet moments of self-sufficiency that I used to take for granted. It was figuring out how to fix my leaky faucet by watching YouTube videos instead of calling someone to rescue me. It was cooking dinner for one, and actually enjoying the process instead of seeing it as sad. It was making decisions big and small, based solely on what I wanted instead of what would make someone else approve of me. I joined a rock climbing gym and discovered I loved the physical challenge and the mental focus it required. I started taking a creative writing class on Tuesday nights just because I'd always been curious about it, and I said yes to a date with a software engineer named David who I met at a coffee shop and who thought my job was incredible instead of impractical. I didn't fall in love with David. We went on 3 dates and realized we were better as friends. But the experience of someone seeing me as interesting and valuable without me having to prove it first was transformative in ways I'm still unpacking. 6 months after I left, on a random Tuesday afternoon when I was grabbing lunch between client sessions, my phone rang from another unknown number and against my better judgment. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fate. I actually answered it. The voice on the other end was my brother Michael, and his tone was so different from anything I'd ever heard from him that it actually stopped me mid-bite of my sandwich. "Emma, we need to talk. It's about Dad." My stomach dropped because despite everything, despite the distance and the healing and the new life, there was still that primal fear that something terrible had happened, that I'd get pulled back into their orbit through tragedy or crisis. But what he said next wasn't about a heart attack or an accident. It was somehow worse and better at the same time. Dad's company is downsizing and he's getting forced into early retirement. And Mom's been calling everyone trying to figure out where you are because apparently they need help with finances, and I just found out you're in Seattle living your best life while we're all dealing with this mess. The way he said best life dripped with so much resentment and accusation that I almost laughed, because the irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The same family that called me useless and kicked me out was now upset that I wasn't available to rescue them when their perfect life started crumbling. I let him finish his whole speech about family obligations and how I was being selfish, and when he finally paused for breath, I said something that had been building in my chest for 6 months. "Michael, I'm sorry Dad is going through that. Truly. But I'm not coming back to save people who threw me away when they thought they didn't need me." The silence on the other end was deafening, and then he said something that revealed just how little they'd actually understood about what they'd done. "You're really going to hold a grudge over some words said in anger? Family forgives, Emma. That's what family does." I felt this heat rising in my chest. Not anger exactly, but something fiercer. Clarity mixed with frustration that after all this time, they still saw their rejection of me as just words said in anger, rather than a pattern of dismissal that had defined my entire childhood and young adulthood. "Michael," I said, keeping my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking. "I'm not holding a grudge. I'm holding boundaries. There's a difference, and the fact that you can't see that is exactly why I needed to leave. I hope things work out for all of you. I really do. But I can't be your safety net when you never let me be your family." That phone call with Michael rattled something loose in my understanding of family dynamics and power structures that I'd been processing subconsciously for months. I ended up talking about it in my therapy session. Yes, I'd started seeing a therapist named Dr. Sarah Kim about 3 months into my Seattle life because I realized I had decades of family dysfunction to unpack. And she said something that crystallized everything. "Emma, your father confused authority with control, and your family confused obedience with love. Real authority comes from earning respect and providing genuine support, not from demanding submission through fear or manipulation." It was like she'd handed me the decoder ring to my entire childhood, and suddenly all those confusing moments where I felt simultaneously wrong for resisting and wrong for complying made perfect sense. I started thinking about the young people I worked with at New Horizons, kids like Jasmine who'd been told their whole lives that they were problems instead of people with problems, and I realized that the best mentors and counselors I knew, including Linda and Marcus, never used their positional authority to control outcomes. They used their experience and wisdom to guide, to support, to believe in potential even when it wasn't visible yet, and they gave young people agency over their own lives instead of demanding they follow a prescribed path. That's what real authority looks like. It's the teacher who inspires you to want to learn, not the one who threatens you with bad grades. It's the parent who helps you develop your own values instead of forcing you to adopt theirs. It's the boss who trusts your judgment instead of micromanaging every decision you make. My father had spent my entire life wielding control and calling it authority, measuring his success as a parent by how well I conformed to his expectations rather than by how well I developed into my own person. When I didn't become the corporate success story he wanted, when I chose social work over business school and helping people over making money, he saw it as defiance instead of what it actually was. Me finding my authentic path. The real kicker is that in his attempt to control me into being useful by his definition, he lost the opportunity to know the actually useful person I became, and that loss is entirely on him. I've helped dozens of young people find their footing. I've created programs that have impacted hundreds of lives. I've built a career that matters. But none of that counts in his ledger because it doesn't come with a corner office and a 6-figure salary, and that's his limitation, not mine. 8 months into my Seattle chapter, I woke up one Saturday morning and realized something that made me laugh out loud in my empty apartment. I was genuinely happy. Not the performative happiness I used to fake at family gatherings or the hopeful things will get better happiness that kept me going during hard times, but real, bone-deep contentment with the life I was living. My studio had transformed into this cozy sanctuary with plants on every windowsill, art from local markets on the walls, and a collection of coffee mugs from different Seattle neighborhoods that told the story of my exploration and gradual claiming of this city as mine. I had a routine that felt good instead of suffocating, morning runs along the waterfront, work that challenged and fulfilled me, Tuesday night writing class, Thursday rock climbing, weekends that were sometimes social and sometimes beautifully solitary, and none of it required anyone's approval except my own. The youth program I'd developed was thriving beyond anything I'd imagined, with a waiting list of kids who wanted to participate, and other organizations reaching out to learn about our model so they could replicate it. I'd published an article in a national social work journal about trauma-informed approaches to youth advocacy, and it got picked up by several major outlets, which led to speaking invitations I was still wrapping my head around. My colleagues had become genuine friends. Linda invited me to her daughter's graduation. Marcus and I had standing lunch plans every Friday, and the team at New Horizons felt more like family than my actual family ever had because they celebrated my wins without jealousy and supported me through struggles without judgment. This was what belonging felt like when you didn't have to twist yourself into shapes to earn it. But the sweetest victory wasn't the external success or the professional recognition. It was the internal peace I'd found in knowing that my worth wasn't up for debate anymore. I didn't need my father to call and apologize. I didn't need Michael to acknowledge he was wrong. I didn't need my mother to suddenly see me clearly, because their opinions had become irrelevant to my self-concept in the healthiest possible way. I'd proven to myself, not to them, that I was capable and valuable and strong, and that proof was in every life I touched through my work, every boundary I maintained for my own well-being, every morning I woke up excited about the day ahead instead of dreading it. Living well truly is the best revenge. Not because it hurts them, but because it heals you. And I was finally, fully healed from the wound of their rejection. 10 months after leaving, I was invited to speak at a national conference on youth services in Chicago, and during my layover at the airport in my hometown, yes, the universe has a sense of irony. I sat in a coffee shop and watched families reuniting at the arrival gates. There was this one moment where a father swept his daughter up in a huge hug and spun her around, both of them laughing, and I felt this pang of grief for something I'd never actually had but had always wanted. The difference now was that the grief didn't consume me. I could feel it, acknowledge it, and let it pass through like weather, because I'd built an identity that wasn't dependent on my father's ability to love me the way I needed. I thought about calling them during that layover, maybe suggesting we meet somewhere neutral and try to have an honest conversation, but then I remembered Michael's call months earlier, and the complete lack of accountability or self-reflection in his words. They weren't looking for reconciliation, they were looking for rescue, and those are two entirely different things. Reconciliation requires both parties to acknowledge harm and commit to change, while rescue requires one person to sacrifice their well-being to prop up someone else's, and I'd already done enough of that to last a lifetime. Maybe someday they'd do the work to understand what they lost and why. Maybe they'd reach out with genuine remorse instead of veiled demands. But I couldn't put my healing on hold waiting for that day to come. The conference presentation went incredibly well. I spoke to about 300 people about creating supportive environments for young people who've been marginalized or dismissed by traditional systems. And during the Q&A session, someone asked me what inspired my approach to this work. I took a breath and said something true. I was once a young person who was told I was useless by the people who were supposed to believe in me most, and I made a choice that instead of internalizing that message, I'd prove it wrong by becoming exactly the kind of support system for others that I wished I'd had myself. The room was silent for a moment, and then people started applauding, not because my story was special, but because it was universal. We've all felt unseen or undervalued at some point, and the question is always whether we let that define us or drive us toward something better. A full year after walking out of my father's house, I received a letter in the mail, an actual physical letter, not a text or email, forwarded from Jessica's address because they still didn't have my direct contact information. The handwriting on the envelope was my mother's, and I sat with that unopened letter on my coffee table for 2 full days, staring at it like it might explode, trying to decide if I was ready to let their words back into my world, even in written form. When I finally opened it, the contents were somehow exactly what I expected, and completely surprising at the same time. It was an invitation to Thanksgiving dinner, written as if the past year had been just a minor blip, as if I could simply show up and pretend nothing had fundamentally changed between us. But tucked inside was a second, smaller note in my father's handwriting, and this is what it said. Emma, your mother misses you and wants you home for the holidays. I understand you're upset about how things ended, but I still believe I was right to push you toward independence. You've proven you can take care of yourself, so perhaps we can move forward now. I read those words 3 times, waiting for the apology that never came, the acknowledgement of harm that wasn't there, the recognition that calling your daughter useless and kicking her out isn't pushing toward independence. It's rejection, plain and simple. He wanted credit for my success, wanted to reframe his cruelty as tough love that had ultimately worked, and the audacity of that rewrite was almost impressive in its complete lack of self-awareness. I didn't respond to the letter, and I didn't go home for Thanksgiving. I spent it with my New Horizons family at a potluck where Linda made the most amazing turkey, and Marcus told embarrassing stories, and I felt surrounded by people who chose to be there, who wanted to celebrate together, who saw me clearly and liked what they saw. That's when I understood the final and most important lesson of this entire journey. You can't make people see your worth if they're determined to keep their eyes closed, but you also don't need them to because your worth exists whether they recognize it or not. My father's validation would have been nice. Sure, in some fantasy world where parents always rise to meet their children's needs, but in the real world where I actually lived, I'd found validation in my work, in my relationships, in the mirror when I looked at myself and genuinely liked the person staring back. So after hearing my story, I want to ask you something important. What would you have done in my place? Would you have gone back when they called, hoping things might be different? Would you have stayed angry, using that anger as fuel, but also as a prison? Or would you have done what I did, walked away, built something new, and found peace in the knowledge that your worth was never theirs to determine in the first place? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I'm genuinely curious how different people would handle this kind of rejection and whether my choice resonates with you or seems too harsh. Here's what I've learned through all of this. Revenge doesn't have to be destructive. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to shrink yourself anymore, refusing to accept someone else's limited vision of who you are, and building a life so fulfilling that their approval becomes irrelevant. My father called me useless as a way to diminish me, but what he actually did was free me from the burden of seeking his approval, and in that freedom, I discovered capabilities and strengths I never would have found if I'd stayed in that house trying to become someone I wasn't. The real question isn't whether revenge brings peace. It's whether living authentically, setting boundaries, and choosing yourself over toxic relationships brings peace. And for me, the answer has been an absolute yes. If you want more stories about overcoming family drama, setting boundaries, and discovering your true strength when people count you out, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because trust me, this is just the beginning. Next week, I'm sharing the story of what happened when my father showed up at my office unannounced 6 months after that Thanksgiving letter. And let's just say that conversation finally gave us both the closure we needed, even if it wasn't the reconciliation either of us had imagined. Don't miss it. And remember, you are not who other people say you are. You are who you choose to become when you finally stop listening to their limitations and start believing in your own potential.